Ramon squinted at the concentrated, trying to see past the rolling mountains that were in front of him to a little clearing on the mountain farthest away that he could see. What he saw was very similar to what you see in the picture on the screen there, similar area to where he was. He had seen that afternoon, he had seen a place that looked a whole lot like the dream that God had given him 8 years ago. When we first started working, when we first started thinking about trying to reach the Halbrook people, and he wasn't sure though if that really was the place, and we had been met by so many obstacles and difficulties. They had actually just had to turn around because of the hostility of the people. They had to turn back, and Ramon looked and tried to see, was that really the place that God had shown him in the dream so long ago? As he looked, he saw a hand come down from heaven, and a finger pointed right at the place. The same place that he thought was what he had seen in the dream. He was filled with excitement and happiness. This was confirmation that it really was the place that God had shown him so many years ago that was ready for the gospel, and even more, it was confirmation that God was still with us, that he was still helping us. But Ramon continued to strain and try to see how God intended for us to get past all those insurmountable obstacles between us and those people. But before he could see what God's plan was, the dream faded. And he woke up again to the reality of the crinkly banana leaves and the rain dripping through the trees under their eyes as they tried to sleep, and the leeches drawing blood out and staining their blankets red. They were on an expedition deep into the Halbrook territory to try to find a village that would let us come in. Some of you may remember about 4 years ago I came and spoke here and told you about a church planting project that I was getting ready to begin on the island of Occidental Mindoro with the Halbrook people. We actually called them the Batangan back then. We found out later that's not what they call themselves. They call themselves the Halbrook. I launched back in September of 2011. I launched to the Philippines, began that project, and many of you here have known my family for many years. In fact, as an aside, while I was sitting up here, I remember somewhere over in this area, I have a distinct memory of getting in trouble for getting silly putty in the carpet, right over here in the church. I went to school here when I was young. But many of you remember that I actually grew up in the Philippines, on the same island on Occidental Mindoro, but just north, with the Alangan tribe, just north of the Halbrook. And so when I arrived in September of 2011, I started there in the village that I had grown up in, the village of Halbrook. And I enlisted the help of several of the church leaders that my parents had helped to mentor and to develop back when we were working there. And I expected that it wouldn't be all that difficult. I expected a little bit of resistance, but I figured that the people would recognize the help that I could bring to them, and that they would be willing to let me come in and work with them. But what I found was quite a bit different. The Halbrook people have done everything in their power to protect them from the outside world, from any outsiders or anything to do with the outside, any outside influence. We found that they've actually hired Alangan, the tribe that I grew up with, they've hired Alangan civil leaders to guard the trailheads into their territory. They pay them very well in upland rights, which is very valuable, and in order to ensure their loyalty, they blackmail them rather with witchcraft. Because you see, the Halbrook are the most spiritually powerful people on the island. Now, it's people who put themselves under Satan's authority by first of all being afraid. Anytime that you fear something, you're under authority, under the authority of that person. And then combine that with the fact that they try to use Satan's power for their own gain. They try to manipulate Satan. So it puts them into subjection to Satan. He can do things for them or to them that here in the West we oftentimes have a hard time even believing. Oftentimes the Halbrook shaman will wipe out entire villages. They'll kill entire villages as they fight amongst themselves. Any person that has spiritual power, typically they tend to be older men. It can be anyone, but typically they tend to be older men. And they'll oftentimes just walk through the territory and they'll find some young bride, newly married young lady that he finds attractive, and he'll demand that the husband give him his wife. And if he doesn't, he will kill the husband. Same thing with pigs or chickens or anything else that they own. People live in constant terror of being killed through witchcraft. And yet they're taught to be even more afraid of outsiders. They're, we would say, brainwashed maybe from a young age that outsiders are much, much scarier and much more harmful and can do much worse things to you than anything that can happen from their own witchcraft. And so they do everything in their power to keep us out. And that's when the waiting begins. You see, growing up, I had read through the Bible, and I read all the texts about waiting on the Lord. It's actually quite a theme, especially in the Old Testament, to wait on the Lord. And there are many texts, many promises that are given in association with waiting on the Lord. And I read all these, and I thought I understood them, but I never really had to practice waiting on the Lord until I started working with the Halbrook. So when God told me to wait, I decided, well, I'll go back and read those texts again, do a little bit of research, and I found some interesting things. Thank you. I found that in every text, almost every text at least, in the Bible, where it tells us to wait on the Lord, if you back up a few verses, you find something about human weakness, either the weakness or the problem that the writer is experiencing, or with the people that he's dealing with. For example, here in Psalm 130, verse 3, if you, O Lord, kept a record of sins, O Lord, who could stand? If you can go ahead and advance that one. Just a couple verses later, you see in verse 5, I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in his word I put my hope. In Lamentations 3:19, I remember my affliction and my wanderings, the bitterness and the gall. And then in our scripture reading this morning, it is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Psalm 127, verse 12, the second half, false witnesses rise up against me, breathing out violence. And then in verse 14, wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. So I thought to myself, okay, maybe God is saying that there are still problems with me, that there's still things that he needs to work out in my own life. Maybe this is a continuation of training, part of training that could only happen when I actually got here and got started working on this project. So I'll wait patiently for the Lord. Maybe there are other problems with other people that I don't know about. So I'll wait patiently for the Lord. But in my research, I also discovered that the children of God never just sat around doing nothing while they waited. They always did whatever they could. You know, you have Saul, when he was waiting for the Lord to take care of the problem with David, when he was waiting for the Lord to take care of the problem with Saul. He made some mistakes, but he also kept busy, and he did a lot of good. He protected Israel's borders. He drove back a number of their enemies. He protected people like Naboth. He did a lot of good. In the New Testament, you have the early Christian believers when they were waiting for Pentecost. Jesus told them to wait in Jerusalem until the Spirit came. But they didn't just sit around twiddling their thumbs. They got together in one place. They spent a lot of time examining themselves and praying, and they took care of some business. They replaced Judas. They replaced him. You also find just many other examples in the Bible. Well, above all else, the prime example of us waiting on the Lord post-Calvary is our waiting for Jesus to come back the second time to take us home again. And Jesus doesn't tell us just sit there doing nothing while we're waiting for him. He has given us the Great Commission, the most noble and honorable task that any human could ever be entrusted with. The task of bringing other people to Christ, to helping our fellow men. And so I decided, well, while I'm waiting, I'll do everything that I can. And for that particular time, when I first arrived there, that entailed visiting the Halbrook territory. So we would go back and forth from our base of operations there in Ponderosa to the Halbrook territory. The people didn't want to have anything to do with us. Typically, they wouldn't make eye contact with us. They wouldn't look at us. They'd just stare at the ground. They wouldn't answer us. But when we talked to them, they would just keep on going. If they did answer us and gave us directions on the trail, we would almost always need to take the opposite of whatever they told us, because they would actually maintain trails that would loop around back on themselves and end you back where you started from. And those are the maintained trails. The ones they didn't maintain were the ones that actually went someplace useful. Several attempts were made on my life and on my team's life. I don't have time to tell all of the stories. But I continued doing what I could while I waited patiently for God. Until finally, God opened the door. You see, I had intended to start in the middle of the territory. I figured strategically that would be best. It would be easiest for the gospel to move and to reach the entire tribe that way. But God consistently closed every door to me getting into the highlands of Halbrook territory. And then finally, after 6 months, he opened a door into the village of Halbrook. Now, Halbrook is a border area, not where I originally intended to go. The people there are actually Halbrook. Some people that have read my writing have been a little confused. They are actually Halbrook people, but they're the people on the border areas that are willing to have interactions with outsiders, basically. So they speak the trade language Tagalog, as well as their own language. They are willing to wear clothes. They're willing to wear Western clothes and eat Western food. I guess that's more of rice and ramen noodles, that kind of thing. They're willing to have interactions with outsiders. So, since God had closed every other door, I opened that one. I moved there and continued to wait. Because I found that, I expected I'd move in there and I'd be able to begin my ministry right away. But I found that there was actually, to my surprise, a small group of Adventist believers in this village. I'd never known that until I arrived there. About 30 years ago, a Filipino lady, had moved nearby, because this is on the border of their territory. She had moved nearby. She didn't really know how to plant a church or to bring someone to Christ, but she knew how to cook. And so she would cook a pot of rice and kill a chicken every single Sabbath. And she would invite everyone from the nearby village of Halbrook to come down and eat with her. And she did this for somewhere between 10 and 15 years before she and another layman finally were able to baptize a number of the people from that village. Then that lady died eventually, and the group of believers there was left never having really been taught a whole lot, never really having been mentored. And so I arrived there, surprised to find a group of believers, but also surprised by some of the funny beliefs they had. What they had done is they had simply replaced the spirit, or the demon, and the killing of chickens and chanting and whatnot to manipulate the demons. They had replaced that with God as the supreme being, and going to church and doing the right things in the right way, in the right order in church, in order to appease and to manipulate God. They were really doing the same thing. They were still animists. They had just switched the deity in a way to manipulate that deity. Well, like I said, I figured it was time to get busy doing what I could. God wasn't letting me move beyond Halbrook. He closed every other door. The first thing I did was to build this house. This is actually the second version. The first one collapsed within about a year and a half. Native materials don't last very long. And the second version has a bathroom. You can see there's a little bit of a bathroom there. There are walls around it now, just to let you know. I also started a livelihood project. This is rubber. This is the beginning of a rubber plantation. See, the people there, for however many centuries or millennia, they've never had winter. Our ancestors, most of our ancestors had winter to prepare for, and we had ingrained into our culture a need to preserve and save and prepare for the future. But all their life, all their ancestors' life, they've always had the jungle, which provided more than enough food for them. They had agriculture, but it was always a very small scale. It wasn't enough to really sustain them. It was just for extra special food, comfort food. And but now they've been pushed, and because of immigration, they've been pushed into such a small territory, and because of deforestation, there just isn't enough jungle left to support them anymore. And the little bit of agriculture that they know how to do isn't enough to sustain them year-round. So our solution originally was to teach them to budget and to save. But between my parents and I, we've been working with these tribes for about 20 years now, and that hasn't caught on yet. So I decided to try something different, and that's this rubber plantation. Because you see, rubber you can harvest every 15 days, all year long. So it provides a steady income for them all year long, and it also provides cash in the world that's coming to them, whether they like it or not. They need cash to buy food, to put their kids through school, and to buy medicine. So this is one project that I started. We'll go on to the next slide. The Carolina Conference also recently helped us to buy a well drill. You'd think that we'd have lots of water there, but because of the deforestation, all the rivers dry up in the dry season far away from us. It kind of turns into a desert around us. And then in the rainy season, water does get down to us, but it's filthy. And so we started putting in deep wells here in the foothills. About 130 feet we usually get water. And go on to the next slide. Probably the most time that I've spent is in medical work. I am not a doctor, just to clarify, but my mom started teaching me what she could when I was young. And I always had medical books growing up around the house. I was reading for fun. And took some training also when I finished college. And this has helped probably more than anything else to break down barriers and to gain the trust of the people. This is a picture of a man who cut his knee open with a machete while I wasn't there. Since I wasn't there, it was a pretty bad wound. He took a day's trip to the hospital to get it sewed up. And the doctor, I'm not sure what he was thinking, the doctor put in internal nylon sutures and then external nylon sutures on top of that. So in the prescribed amount of time, the external sutures were taken out, but nobody knew that there were internal ones still in there, non-absorbable. And so when I got back, the wound just kept on festering and festering and festering. And so he came to me for help. It took me a while to figure out what was going on. When I did, I had to cut it open and remove those sutures and suture back up again properly. I remember another kid, his father came running into the house one night, in the middle of the night, during a hurricane. And his son, just a baby, had drank a tin can full of kerosene. And he was on the verge of dying. He was having a really hard time breathing. And with the hurricane, there was no way that we ever would have gotten him out to the hospital if he had made it to the hospital anyway in time. And I prayed for him and gave him a shot and gave him a bunch of charcoal and milk as well. And by God's grace, one of those things must have worked, and his life was saved. There are many other lives also that have been saved similarly. But I kept wondering, this is great, and it's really fulfilling to know that someone is alive today because I'm there. I wouldn't be if I hadn't been there. But that's not really why I was there. One of my professors in college said, what's the point of making healthy sinners? And I was afraid that I was just making healthy sinners. And so I would get down on my knees day after day asking God, why won't you open the doors? Why won't you let me do the work that you called me here to do? And all he kept telling me was, wait on the Lord. I'm going to the next slide. Another family friend taught me to pull teeth. I found this is actually really fun. I never imagined that pulling teeth could be so much fun. It's a good workout. My dental services are starting to become more popular actually than my medical services. Just this year I pulled 50 teeth. Go on to the next slide. Probably the biggest thing that I did, though, the most important thing that I did during those first 2.5 years of waiting was to work with the group of believers there. Like I said, they had developed some kind of funny ideas. One of the church elders, when I first arrived there, told me that the hymns in the Tagalog SDA hymnal were written by the 144,000. They had to be sung, and they had to be sung exactly correctly in order for a person to be saved. And this is just one example of some of the things that they believed. So they were advocates in name, but they had some funny ideas, and they definitely didn't understand how a person was saved, and they didn't have a relationship with Christ. And I was almost kicked out of the village as a heretic before I was able to help them with this. But that was the biggest thing that I did for those first 2.5 years, was to work to bring them back to a foundation of Christ, and to help them understand the relationship with Christ, and that we're saved through faith in Him, and that our work, the things that we do for God, are a response, a loving response to what He has done for us. And just about the time that people started catching on, at least a small core group of people in this church started catching on, started getting the vision, and also started getting on fire for reaching their people, it was just about that time that God finally started to crack open the door. And we came across Vincent. Now Vincent, I had met just after I got there, actually. I first met him. He had spinal tuberculosis, and he had been shuffling around for 4 years from shaman to shaman in the highlands, trying to find relief from this disease. And of course, the shaman couldn't do anything for him. Eventually, he went to a shaman who was nearby my area, and he heard about my skill at helping people who were sick. And so he asked me to come see what I could do for him. And so I came and assessed him. The shaman, his shaman wasn't there that day. His witch doctor wasn't there. So I assessed him and told him the bad news was that his spine had already collapsed quite a bit. So he had a hunchback, and he was mostly paralyzed. He could feel a little bit, but he couldn't walk. So I told him the bad news is that with the facilities we had, most likely his back would never be straight again. But if he was willing to come home with me and to be treated by me for a year to year and a half, that we could kick this disease. He could get over it, and he wouldn't die. And most likely, he would recover the ability to walk. When I told him that, I saw a spark of hope come into his eyes. It's It's the look in people's eyes that I live for, the reason that I'm there, the reason that I keep on going, even though God tells me to wait and wait and wait. When I saw that spark of hope in his eyes, I knew that not only did he have hope that he would be healed, but also that he would be free from the life of fear that he lived. Because you see, for them, they understand that when they come to me for medicine, when they ask me for help to try my medicine, they're not just trying Western medicine, they're also trying God. They understand that God gave us Western medicine and that he provides the power behind it and the understanding of how to use it. So when they come to us, to me, asking for medicine, they're also wanting to try God. And so when Vincent agreed to be treated, he also agreed to try God and see if God was a better solution than the fear that he had been living with. Well, like I said, he was paralyzed, couldn't walk. I had a water buffalo. I have a water buffalo back in the village. And so I told him that I would come back the next day. I would bring my water buffalo so we could ride that home. Big mistake. I should have done something. I should have carried him on my back, something, in order to get him out of there right then. The next day when we came back, his shaman had come back, and he was mad. He sat there and yelled at us constantly for about 30 minutes, just yelling at us straight for 30 minutes. Finally, I decided that wasn't going to end. So I just went over to Vincent and told him, look, God can protect you from this shaman. He can protect you from whatever curses he will put on you. You can be healed. You can be free from this. And you can be free from the slavery that you've been living in all your life. Won't you please come home with me? But his eyes were already dull with resignation. He didn't know God well enough. He didn't know him well enough to trust him, to protect him from that shaman, from the curses that he would put on him. And so he stayed behind. Well, that was all those years ago. Just about the time, like I said, that the people in the believers in Balangam started to catch the vision, I ran across Vincent again. Another shaman, a different shaman, he had Vincent as well as 5 other patients in his house. All of them were dying. And he was willing to admit that he couldn't do anything for them. And so he called me and asked me if I would take over his patients. He turned all of his patients over to me. The other 5 were dying of some of them measles, some of them TB. All of them have recovered from that point. And Vincent came home with me that day. I didn't make sure that the sun didn't go down before Vincent was back in our village again. It's been a long haul. He didn't recover immediately. It takes a long time with TB. He actually got really discouraged because he wasn't responding. It had been 2 or 3 months and he wasn't responding. We figured out that he had an abscess actually over his spine that was putting a lot of pressure on it. And my supervisor got me in touch with an orthopedic surgeon back here who walked me through opening that up. So I opened up his back, drained the pus out, and instantly his pain and his paralysis was relieved. The orthopedic surgeon told me to keep as much weight off his spine as possible, but I couldn't keep the guy under control. The next morning I woke up and looked out under my eaves, and here's Vincent on the roof of his next-door neighbor drying out bamboo so we could make baskets. Every day I would take Vincent his medicine, make sure he was taking them properly. And every day when I would do that, I would also tell him stories about Jesus, tell him stories from the Bible, actually starting in Genesis, going all the way through. And I would tell him about God. And Vincent came to believe in God. He's still a little bit scared about the idea of baptism. That makes him nervous. But he has declared his faith in God, and he wants to be saved, and he wants to be in heaven. And God has actually given him a number of dreams, indicating that God intends to use him to reach the Halbrook, to reach his people for the Lord. So Vincent is our very first Highland Halbrook convert. Amen. Next one. One of the things of the 2 tribes, I talked about the Allen where I grew up with. They got really excited when I came. They had never really known each other before I came. They knew that they existed, but they had never interacted much. They have a hard time finding people, spouses for their kids that they're not related to. The tribe is small enough that everybody's related to everyone else. So when I got the 2 tribes together, one of the things they were really excited about is to have a larger gene pool, other people for their kids to marry. One of our young ladies, the young ladies in our church, up and disappeared for about 6 months. And when she showed back up again, she had an Alangan husband in tow. And so we were kind of excited about that. And he and I exchanged greetings, but we were both kind of shy, so we didn't talk a whole lot. His name was Angelo. Well, a few weeks later, I started a baptismal study for a number of people in our village who who were interested in becoming Christians, and I invited anyone else who was interested to come as well. And Angelo showed up. In fact, he was my most faithful student and came every single night. And one night, before we both showed up early, before everyone else, and he started to tell me, he said, you know, you saved my life when I was just a baby. I said, really? I don't remember this. Well, it turns out that back in late elementary school, I think it was, late elementary school, my parents had to travel quite a bit, and sometimes they actually had to leave for up to a month at a time. And I stayed with my adopted family over there, and my mom had trained me to run the clinic as best as I could. And so Angelo's parents actually brought him as a baby. He was dying of pneumonia and malaria combined. And so I treated him as best I could, and his parents took him home, and I never heard back from him. In fact, I completely forgot about the whole incident. But apparently he had recovered, saved his life. And all those years growing up, his parents told him the story of how I had saved his life. And he knew in his heart that if ever he could find me again, if he could just find me again, that he would become whatever I am. And so all these years later, God put me and him both in a completely different area, brought us back together again. And when he saw me, he recognized me. And even though he had never told anyone his promise, he knew in his heart that it was time to keep that promise. And so he came faithfully to those baptismal studies, and last April, he was baptized at our native camp meeting. Amen. Amen. God has promised in his word that his word will not come back to him empty. Wait on the Lord. Wait on the Lord. And go on to the next one. Another area that's opened up recently, there's a village nearby, the village that I live in, the village of Layaban. They allowed us to come in. It's a completely non-Christian village. Nobody there believes, but they allowed us to come in and start doing Bible studies with some of the people there. In fact, at one point, almost everybody in the village, including the shamans, were taking Bible studies from us. And once those started to conclude, we asked them if we could hold an evangelistic series, and they said, sure. And so we came in. Sorry, it's not a very clear picture, but that's us holding an evangelistic series there. And a number of people, for the first time ever, understood where the spirits came from and why they lived and feared the spirits all the time. They wanted to be free from that. They wanted to become Christians. Well, the village elders became very threatened by this. They had let us come in. I think it must have been a miracle. God must have worked in their hearts to open them up, to allow us to come in. But as soon as they realized that people were wanting to become Christians, they immediately shut the doors. They kicked us out and they said, you cannot come back in here again. We had between 13 and 15 people who wanted to become Christians. And so we got down on our knees and we said, Lord, what are we going to do? How can we nurture these people? They kicked us out. They won't let us come back in again and nurture these people who want to become Christians. What are we going to do? And God said again, wait. Well, a couple weeks later, one of my church members went and visited on his own, went and visited the chief of Layaban. His daughter had a chronic disease that we couldn't do anything about at the time. And so he asked the chief, he said, can I move my family here just to give my daughter a change of scenery, see if that helps, and try some herbal remedies that my in-laws here know. And the chief said, sure, you can come in. We'd be glad to have you move in here, but don't do any evangelism. Don't hold any Bible studies. Don't go around trying to convert people. His name is Sandy. So Sandy came back to me and he was really excited. He said, look, we got in. It's great, we got in. But they won't let us do anything. What are we going to do? They won't let us hold Bible studies. They won't let us evangelize. What are we going to do? And I said, don't worry about it. I said, in your home, every morning and every evening, hold your own family worship. They can't stop you from doing that. And sing your heart out. Those thin bamboo walls can't contain your singing. The whole village will be able to hear your singing. And every Sabbath, do the same thing. They can't stop you from holding services in your own home. They had told us specifically we could not build a church there. But you can't, I said, they can't stop you from singing and holding church in your own house. And again, sing your heart out, and the whole village will hear. And the people whom God is calling, people whom God has touched, whose hearts that he has touched, will hear, and they'll come. This actually happened just before I came home on furlough. So I haven't heard a whole lot, but I know that just before I came back, that first Sabbath that he was there, he already had 2 families that were coming and worshiping with him on Sabbath. And I've heard since then from my partner, who's stayed behind there, a native partner from the Island tribe. Sorry, I hadn't told you about that. So I phoned him, and he told me that the church continues to grow there, that God has continued to grow and to protect them. And so this is our very first church plant among the Halbrook people. maybe asking you to wait on him. I know for me, like with Angelo, it took about 15 years for the seed that was planted when he was just a baby and I was just an early teenager. It took 15 years, and it took divine, more than just an appointment. And he moved me from the Philippines back to America, and then back to the Philippines in a different place, and then moved Angelo, got him hooked up with this girl who brought her back to that same place. It took all of that, God's maneuvering, in order for us to come back together again, so that he could find me again, and that seed could germinate. And it took 15 years. Sometimes it takes a long time, but God tells us to wait on him, and his word is sure. Maybe some of you have had similar experiences. Maybe you've planted seeds all your life and waited for those to bear fruit. And maybe you're wondering why it seems that you haven't seen people coming into the gospel, coming to Christ as a result of your work. Wait on the Lord. Wait on the Lord and continue planting those seeds while you're waiting for him. Maybe it's not you, maybe it's someone else. You know, I remember my grandparents were hurt in the church when they were pretty young, long before I was ever around. Over the Desmond Ford issue, they were hurt pretty badly, and it took them all their lives. It wasn't until just a few years before they died that they finally reconciled with Christ and came back to a relationship and a love for God. We were praying for them all those years. We had to wait on the Lord. Maybe you have similar, maybe you have relatives or friends that you're waiting for to come back. Be patient and wait on the Lord, and continue witnessing to them through your life. Maybe it's your own spiritual life. Maybe you feel dry and like your spiritual life is dead. Don't give up. Don't give up. Keep pressing on. God has promised that if we seek for him with all our hearts, that he will be found by us. Wait on the Lord. Psalm 37, verse 7 says, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when men succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently